Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The historical information, legal frameworks, and financial trends discussed in this video regarding divorce, asset division, alimony, and family law are strictly for educational and entertainment purposes only. The landscape of divorce law is incredibly complex and varies drastically from state to state and across different historical eras. Nothing in this presentation constitutes professional legal counsel, financial planning, tax advice, or marital therapy. The dissolution of a marriage carries profound legal and economic consequences, and historical outcomes do not predict future results in individual cases. Always conduct your own rigorous due diligence and consult with licensed attorneys, certified financial planners, and tax professionals in your specific jurisdiction before making any decisions related to marriage, divorce, or asset management. The greatest wealth-destroying event in the lifespan of the average American is not a stock market crash, a prolonged period of hyperinflation, a sudden medical emergency, or even the loss of a primary career. It is a highly systemic legal process that over 40% of married couples will eventually endure, yet almost no one financially prepares for with any real strategic depth. We are talking about the complete, legalized dissolution of the middle-class American family through the modern mechanism of divorce. But what if the very legal frameworks designed half a century ago to liberate individuals from unhappy or abusive marriages secretly became the most efficient engine for transferring wealth out of the middle class and into the hands of the legal, real estate, and financial industries? To understand the sheer magnitude of this hidden economic crisis, we have to look closely at the silent devastation occurring in quiet suburban neighborhoods across the United States. Picture a typical modern middle-class household. 2 incomes, a 30-year mortgage on a 4-bedroom home, 2 financed vehicles, retirement accounts that are slowly compounding, and a modest, heavily prioritized college fund for the children. On paper, this is the realization of the American dream, a carefully constructed financial fortress built on the assumption of continuous dual-income stability. But the moment a divorce petition is filed, that fortress is not just dismantled piece by piece, it is financially carpet-bombed. The fundamental, inescapable mathematics of divorce dictate that the exact same pool of income that previously sustained one consolidated household must now be violently stretched to sustain 2 completely separate, redundant households. This effectively halves the standard of living for both individuals practically overnight. Yet, this brutal mathematical reality only scratches the absolute surface of the true historical cost. When we track the economic data from the late 1960s to the present day, a chilling historical pattern emerges. While the upper class can usually absorb the immense financial shock of asset division through deeply diversified portfolios, inherited generational wealth, and complex corporate structures, and the lower class is often insulated by a lack of heavily taxable divisible assets and a forced reliance on various social safety nets, the American middle class is uniquely positioned for absolute financial catastrophe during a divorce. Their wealth is almost entirely locked in highly illiquid assets, primarily the equity in a primary residence and highly regulated, penalized retirement accounts. When the family court system forces the immediate liquidation or division of these specific, time-dependent assets, the middle-class wealth engine stalls permanently, losing decades of compound interest in a matter of months. But how did we get here? How did the laws shift from protecting the marital estate to systematically dissolving it at immense friction costs? There is a specific turning point in American history, a single legislative signature in a single state that triggered a nationwide domino effect, forever altering the financial destiny of millions of families. By the end of this deep dive, you will see exactly what that moment was, how it silently rewrote the rules of middle-class wealth accumulation, and the precise step-by-step historical evolution that turned the family court system into a multi-billion-dollar industry operating at the direct expense of the American middle class. The promise of this masterclass is to provide you with a comprehensive, unflinching historical overview of how divorce became the ultimate middle-class trap. We are going to decode the complex, often hidden intersection of family law, macroeconomic policy, and American social history to explain exactly why the financial security of the American family feels so incredibly fragile today. For anyone currently navigating a marriage, contemplating a divorce, or simply trying to understand why middle-class wealth generation seems exponentially harder than it was for our grandparents, this historical context is absolutely vital. You cannot protect your financial future or understand the societal forces at play if you do not understand the historical precedents that are actively working against your household balance sheet. We will trace the roots of this phenomenon all the way back to the post-World War II era, a time when the nuclear family was not just a social ideal or a moral imperative, but the fundamental, irreplaceable economic building block of the newly prosperous American empire. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, the United States experienced an unprecedented, debt-fueled economic expansion. Through massive government interventions like the GI Bill, heavily subsidized Federal Housing Administration loans, and sweeping investments in national infrastructure, a newly minted, remarkably robust middle class was engineered almost overnight. The financial architecture of this golden era was built entirely around the single-earner nuclear family model. The federal tax codes, the banking regulations, the zoning laws, and the rapidly expanding real estate markets all heavily incentivized and heavily subsidized the traditional marriage. A single manufacturing, trade, or mid-level corporate salary was structurally sufficient to purchase a suburban home, raise 3 or more children, and secure a highly predictable, comfortable retirement. During this specific historical window, divorce was not only socially stigmatized to an extreme degree, but it was incredibly difficult to obtain legally. The legal framework of the time required a strict demonstration of legal fault, such as proven adultery, extreme physical cruelty, or prolonged legal abandonment. Because the barrier to entry for divorce was placed so incredibly high by the state, the middle-class wealth unit remained largely intact by sheer legal force, allowing for the uninterrupted, long-term compound growth of household assets over decades. The financial stability of the individual marriage was seen as directly correlated with the broader macroeconomic stability of the national economy. However, this era of forced legal cohesion often came at a profound, unacceptable human cost. This rigid system trapped countless individuals, predominantly women who lacked independent access to credit or the labor market, in abusive, dangerous, or deeply unfulfilling marriages simply because the legal and financial escape routes did not structurally exist. As the massive cultural revolutions of the 1960s began to aggressively challenge traditional institutional authority across all sectors of American life, the rigid, fault-based legal structures surrounding marriage naturally came under intense, justified, and fierce public scrutiny. The rising demand for personal autonomy, civil rights, and individual liberation began to clash violently with the rigid, inflexible economic architecture of the post-war middle class. The historical stage was perfectly set for a massive legal upheaval, one that would attempt to solve a severe, undeniable social problem, but would inadvertently create a catastrophic, long-lasting economic vulnerability that we are still dealing with today. To truly grasp the devastating impact of what was to come next, we must deeply dissect the anatomy of middle-class wealth during the mid-20th century. Unlike the ultra-wealthy whose massive net worth is shielded within irrevocable trusts, offshore holding companies, and deeply diversified liquid market assets, the standard middle-class balance sheet was breathtakingly simple and entirely exposed to legal disruption. The primary asset was always the home equity, representing a forced savings account driven by relentless, 30-year monthly mortgage payments. The secondary asset was the defined benefit pension plan, a solid promise of future security inherently tied to decades of loyal, uninterrupted corporate or union employment. These two core pillars required unbroken continuity and immense amounts of time to function effectively. They were absolutely not designed to be split down the middle midway through their maturation cycle. When a legal system forces the premature, distressed sale of a heavily mortgaged primary home, it triggers massive transaction costs, real estate agent commissions, staging fees, and severe capital gains implications, destroying a massive percentage of the stored equity in the sheer friction of the transaction alone. When that same system divides a pension or a 401k, it fundamentally alters the complex actuarial math that guaranteed its payout, often triggering massive early withdrawal penalties and tax burdens. The wealth of the middle class was and remains a delicate, time-dependent ecosystem that only ever thrived in an environment of complete, uninterrupted stability. The political and legal architects of the impending legal revolution of the late 60s and early 70s did not fully calculate, or perhaps chose to ignore, the devastating friction costs of legally dividing this highly specific, highly illiquid type of wealth. They viewed the concept of divorce primarily through the noble lens of social justice, personal safety, and individual freedom, largely ignoring the brutally unforgiving laws of compound interest and macroeconomics. They operated under the assumption that splitting one financially stable household would simply result in two slightly less stable, but ultimately viable, independent economic units. They entirely failed to anticipate the stagnant real wages, the spiraling stagflation of the 70s, and the exponential crushing rise in the cost of living that would fiercely define the decades immediately following this massive legal shift. The sudden intersection of these two massive historical forces, the newly created legal ease of dissolving a marriage, and the increasingly hostile, unforgiving economic environment for single-earner households, created a perfect, devastating storm. It slowly transformed the middle-class divorce from a difficult, isolated personal transition into a highly predictable, mathematically certain financial wipeout for millions of Americans. Understanding the exact granular mechanics of this shift is the only way to understand the modern American wealth gap. To pinpoint the exact epicenter of this tectonic shift, we must travel back to California in the year 1969. The stroke of a pen by then-Governor Ronald Reagan brought the Family Law Act into existence, introducing a legal framework that would completely rewire the economic destiny of the American family. That concept was no-fault divorce. Prior to this legislation, dissolving a marriage required a provable offense in a court of law. It required immense legal friction. It required a high barrier to entry that incidentally acted as a massive, impenetrable protective moat around the pooled assets of the middle-class estate. By removing the requirement of fault, the state effectively transformed the marriage contract from a binding, lifelong economic partnership into an at-will arrangement, terminable by either party at any time, for any reason or no reason at all. While championed socially as a necessary triumph of personal liberty, the macroeconomic shockwaves of this single piece of legislation were immediate, severe, and entirely unmodeled by the financial planners of the era. The moment unilateral no-fault divorce became the law of the land, spreading from California across the entire United States like wildfire throughout the 1970s and 80s, the fundamental risk profile of the middle-class household inverted completely. Let us look at the historical trends to understand the sheer gravity of this change. In the decade following the passage of the Family Law Act, the national divorce rate surged by an astonishing margin, fundamentally altering the demographic landscape of the country. But this was not merely a sociological phenomenon. It was an unprecedented mass liquidation event. Millions of households suddenly found themselves forced into a brutal, accelerated division of assets within a legal framework that possessed absolutely no mechanism to preserve the actual intrinsic value of those assets during the split. Imagine, if you will, a standard case study of an American family navigating this reality, whether in the late 20th century or even right now in the year 2026. Consider a public proxy couple, James and Mary. They represent the classic middle-class demographic. They own a modest suburban home, heavily leveraged with a 30-year mortgage, and possess retirement accounts tied to their primary wage-earning years. Before the legal shifts of 1969, the system heavily discouraged the disruption of this financial unit. After the widespread adoption of no-fault divorce, when a couple like James and Mary enters the family court system, they are not met with financial counselors or wealth preservation strategists. They are thrust directly into an adversarial arena governed by the strict principles of equitable distribution or community property, depending on their specific jurisdiction. The court mandates what appears to be a fair division of the marital estate. On paper, this sounds perfectly just. In absolute mathematical reality, it functions as a highly efficient wealth destruction engine. The family home, which acts as the absolute crown jewel of the middle-class balance sheet, cannot simply be divided down the middle. It must be sold to the open market, or one party must completely buy out the equity of the other. In a forced liquidation scenario, the friction costs are absolutely staggering. You have a standard real estate agent commission, massive closing costs, staging expenses, property transfer taxes, and necessary moving fees. Instantly, a massive percentage of the total built-up equity vanishes into the transaction process itself. If one spouse attempts to buy out the other to keep the children in the same school district, they must suddenly qualify to refinance the entire remaining mortgage balance on a newly halved single income. In the economic environment of 2026, this often means refinancing at significantly higher interest rates, entirely resetting the 30-year amortization schedule, and completely wiping out years of front-loaded interest payments. The forced liquidation of the American dream home became the first great, unavoidable tax levied by the modern family court system. But the economic destruction extends far beyond physical real estate. Consider the historical trends surrounding the division of complex retirement assets. During the massive corporate transition from guaranteed pensions to individual 401k plans, the complexity of dividing future wealth amplified the financial casualties for the middle class. When a retirement account is divided via a qualified domestic relations order, the sheer administrative fees, the legal billing hours required to draft the highly specific document, and the lost potential of uninterrupted compound interest permanently cripple the retirement timeline for both individuals. It is a mathematical certainty that two separate diminished accounts, drained by immense legal fees and potential early withdrawal penalties required to cover the immediate costs of establishing a redundant second household, will never match the upward trajectory of a single, unbroken portfolio. The compound interest curve is fundamentally shattered, and for the wage-earning middle class, time is the one asset that can never be replenished by simply working harder. The downstream effects of this continuous generational wealth splitting are highly visible across the economic landscape today. The American public is currently grappling with an unprecedented retirement crisis and an insurmountable housing affordability gap. While mainstream financial analysis often points to inflation, corporate monopolies, or global supply chain issues as the primary culprits, they routinely ignore the silent, compounding variable of 50 years of systemic marital dissolution. We are currently observing the delayed, macroeconomic consequences of dividing middle-class capital formations at exactly the moment they should be compounding at their highest possible velocity. The modern legal framework inadvertently weaponized the family court system against the very class of people it was theoretically designed to protect, turning the process of uncoupling into a mandatory, catastrophic wealth transfer away from the family unit. It is crucial to understand the potential outcomes of this system compared to different socioeconomic classes. The ultra-wealthy do not experience this phenomenon in the same catastrophic manner. Massive generational wealth is insulated by ironclad prenuptial agreements, irrevocable offshore trusts, and complex corporate entities that do not physically dissolve when a marriage ends. The legal system for the wealthy is the sophisticated transition of paper wealth and stock allocations. Conversely, the legal system for the middle class mandates the physical liquidation of tangible, life-sustaining assets. This two-tiered legal reality has drastically accelerated the hollowing out of the American middle class over the past 5 decades. When the legal barrier to entry for divorce dropped to zero, the financial exit costs skyrocketed, creating a structural paradox that traps modern couples on a perilous financial tightrope. Every single mortgage payment, every localized tax assessment, and every retirement contribution is fundamentally vulnerable to an unmitigated, unilateral liquidation event at any given moment. This massive structural vulnerability laid the perfect economic groundwork for an entirely new, highly lucrative sector of the American economy to emerge and thrive. As millions of middle-class estates were pushed through this new legal meat grinder throughout the late 20th century and into the 21st, a vast, complex ecosystem of professionals realized there were billions of dollars to be continuously extracted from the sheer friction of these mandatory asset divisions. But how exactly did the system morph from a localized, necessary legal procedure into a sprawling, profit-driven industrial complex? How did the state-mandated formulas dictating alimony and child support become deeply untethered from the actual, realistic cost of living, creating lifelong financial obligations that routinely drive wage earners into bankruptcy? The answers lie in the silent, rapid expansion of the family court apparatus itself, and what happened when state and federal governments realized they could directly monetize the disintegration of the American family. To understand how this monetization actually occurred, we must look at a seemingly obscure piece of federal legislation passed in 1975, known as Title 4D of the Social Security Act. On the surface, the historical intent of this law was entirely rational and publicly supported. The federal government wanted to track down absentee parents who had abandoned their families and force the single custodial parent to rely on state welfare programs. The goal was to recover those taxpayer funds by aggressively enforcing child support. However, what began as a necessary mechanism for welfare recovery rapidly evolved into an incredibly powerful financial engine that permanently altered the trajectory of the American middle class. The critical mechanism embedded within Title 4D is a system of federal financial incentives paid directly to the states. Under this framework, state governments receive federal matching funds based on their performance in establishing and collecting child support. Simply put, the more child support a state orders and collects, the more federal money flows into that state's general treasury to fund its own bureaucratic infrastructure. This created a profound systemic conflict of interest. While the family court system is theoretically tasked with finding the most equitable custody arrangement for the children of a divorcing couple, the state government overseeing that court has a direct, undeniable financial incentive to maximize the dollar amount of the child support order. And the most effective mathematical way to maximize a child support order is to establish a stark disparity in parenting time, designating one parent as the primary custodial recipient and the other as the secondary visitor and primary payer. Imagine a case study right now, in the year 2026, involving a middle-class couple named David and Emily. They both work full-time jobs, they both actively participate in raising their children, and they both contribute to the household income. When they enter the family court system to dissolve their marriage, a purely equal 50-50 shared parenting arrangement would logically result in a negligible or non-existent child support order, as both parents are providing roughly equal direct care and financial support. But a $0 child support order generates absolutely zero federal matching funds for the state. Therefore, the historical trends demonstrate a massive systemic bias toward creating primary and secondary custodial roles, even when both parents are perfectly fit and historically involved. By legally restricting David to seeing his children only every other weekend, the state can artificially maximize Emily's child support entitlement. This maximizes David's monthly financial obligation, which in turn maximizes the federal performance bonus the state receives. The children become the unwitting inventory in a state-sponsored revenue generation program. But the state is just the primary beneficiary of this system. The sheer complexity and adversarial nature of this mandated wealth division gave rise to an entire secondary economy, the divorce industry. Prior to the 1970s, family law was often considered a minor, less prestigious branch of legal practice. Today, it is a multi-billion-dollar juggernaut fueled entirely by the forced liquidation of middle-class assets. When David and Emily realize the massive financial and personal stakes involved in their custody and asset division, they are practically forced to retain legal counsel. This introduces the most destructive element of the modern middle-class divorce, the billable hour. Unlike personal injury cases, which are typically taken on contingency or criminal defense, which often involves a flat fee, family law operates almost exclusively on an open-ended hourly billing model. This structural reality means that every single disagreement, every delayed email response, every minor dispute over a piece of furniture, and every temporary hearing actively enriches the legal professionals while directly depleting the marital estate. Let us examine the step-by-step financial bleed of a typical middle-class contested divorce. First, massive retainers are heavily extracted from the shared savings account or funded by high-interest credit cards, instantly introducing toxic debt into an already fractured financial situation. Then, the ecosystem expands to include a mandatory army of ancillary professionals. If there is a dispute over the value of a small business or a retirement portfolio, forensic accountants are hired at hundreds of dollars an hour. If there is a dispute over custody, the court will often appoint a guardian ad litem or mandate expensive psychological evaluations, all of which must be paid for directly by the depleting marital funds. This friction economy thrives on conflict. If David and Emily were to sit down at a kitchen table and rationally divide their assets, the divorce industry would starve. Therefore, the standard operating procedure within the adversarial court system is to immediately file aggressive motions, freeze bank accounts, and demand maximum possible concessions, forcing the opposing party into a defensive, highly expensive legal posture. The middle-class wealth, which was carefully built over a decade of disciplined saving, is suddenly redirected to pay for two opposing legal teams whose financial survival depends on the conflict continuing as long as possible. It is a mathematical certainty that by the time a final decree is issued, a massive percentage of the family net worth has simply evaporated, legally transferred from the middle class to the professional class. Furthermore, we must examine the historical evolution of spousal support, commonly known as alimony. Originally conceived in an era where women were structurally excluded from the primary workforce and deeply dependent on their husbands for basic survival, lifetime alimony was a necessary social safety net. However, as the American economy rapidly transitioned into the dual-earner reality of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the legal application of alimony routinely failed to adapt to the new macroeconomic reality. Today, the potential outcomes for the higher-earning spouse, regardless of gender, often involve being saddled with prolonged or even permanent spousal support obligations based on gross income algorithms that completely ignore the crushing reality of federal taxes, state taxes, FICA, and the spiraling localized cost of living. When the court forces the primary earner to subsidize the lifestyle of the former spouse while simultaneously demanding they maintain their own separate, redundant household, it permanently destroys their ability to generate new capital. They are trapped in a cycle of indentured servitude to their own past, effectively barred from ever participating in the wealth-building phases of the American economy again. They cannot save for a new down payment, they cannot adequately fund their heavily depleted retirement accounts, and they are acutely vulnerable to any minor economic shock, such as a localized job loss or a medical emergency. The legal system has legally mandated their permanent economic stagnation. This structural dismantling of the middle-class balance sheet is not an accidental byproduct of a broken system. It is the exact mathematical outcome of a system functioning exactly as it was designed and incentivized to operate over the last 50 years. But the true tragedy of this massive wealth transfer extends far beyond the immediate financial ruin of the divorcing couple. The most devastating long-term consequence of the family court industry is not what it does to the parents, but what it fundamentally steals from the next generation. What happens to the American economy when millions of children watch their inheritance, their college funds, and their family homes liquidated to pay for legal fees? What happens when an entire generation is raised in the localized poverty of a fractured household? The economic data surrounding the children of this system reveals a reality that the legal industry desperately wants to keep hidden. When we examine the empirical data surrounding the children of this system, a stark and undeniable reality emerges, fundamentally contradicting the sanitized narrative promoted by the modern divorce industry. The legal and psychological communities often frame the dissolution of a marriage as a difficult but ultimately healthy transition, insisting that children are remarkably resilient and will inevitably thrive as long as their parents are happy. But when we strip away the sociological platitudes and strictly analyze the macroeconomic outcomes, the historical trends indicate something entirely different. For the American middle class, the family court system functions as an incredibly efficient machine for the intergenerational destruction of wealth, effectively guaranteeing that the children of a divided household will launch into adulthood severely economically disadvantaged compared to their peers from intact homes. The intact, traditional nuclear family operates as a highly efficient, private welfare state. It internalizes massive costs, subsidizes housing, healthcare, nutrition, and education with zero bureaucratic friction, and compounds its surplus value over time. When the state forces the legal division of that private welfare system, the economic efficiency instantly vanishes, replaced by a mathematically unsustainable reality that the children are ultimately forced to subsidize. Imagine, if you will, a case study set right now in the year 2026. We will look at a teenager named Michael, the son of the previously mentioned middle-class couple, David and Emily. Prior to the initiation of the divorce proceedings, Michael was situated on a highly predictable, historically standard upward trajectory. His parents, operating with the surplus of a combined dual income, had faithfully contributed to a 529 college savings plan since his birth. They resided in a stable, appreciating suburban neighborhood perfectly zoned for a high-performing public high school. Michael was insulated by the shared economic fortress of his parents' marriage. However, the moment the legal dissolution begins, Michael's financial future is quietly placed on the chopping block to satisfy the immense, immediate capital requirements of the legal process. During the mandatory adversarial division of assets, liquid capital is the very first casualty. The robust 529 plan, initially earmarked to guarantee Michael a debt-free entry into the professional workforce, suddenly becomes a highly vulnerable target. In the brutal calculus of family court, potential outcomes frequently involve this educational fund being explicitly liquidated, incurring massive tax penalties and early withdrawal fees, simply to cover the spiraling costs of legal retainers, forensic accountants, and mandatory mediation sessions. Even if the fund is legally protected from direct liquidation, the forward-looking contributions instantly drop to zero. David and Emily, now desperate to finance two entirely separate, redundant households in the hyperinflated housing market of 2026, simply no longer possess the disposable income to fund their child's future. Michael's trajectory fundamentally shifts. He goes from the potential outcome of graduating university debt-free, ready to immediately begin accumulating his own capital, to being forced to take on massive, high-interest federal and private student loans just to secure the exact same degree. This is not a personal failure on Michael's part, nor is it necessarily a malicious act by his parents. It is a systemic wealth transfer. The capital that was diligently stored for the next generation was legally and systemically rerouted to fund the operational friction of the divorce industry. Furthermore, we must deeply analyze the devastating geographic and educational displacement caused by the forced liquidation of the primary middle-class asset, the family home. The American public education system is intrinsically linked to localized property taxes. High property values dictate high school funding, better resources, and enhanced advanced placement programs. When the family court mandates the sale of David and Emily's home to satisfy the laws of equitable distribution, a massive percentage of their accumulated equity is destroyed in the sheer transaction costs. With their newly halved, diminished capital, neither parent can typically afford to buy back into the same high-tier neighborhood. Consequently, the two resulting households almost universally relocate to more affordable, less desirable geographic zones. Michael is suddenly pulled from a high-performing, stable educational environment and inserted into an underfunded district during his most critical developmental years. Historical trends show a brutal, direct correlation between this specific type of geographic instability and dramatically lower standardized test scores, reduced college acceptance rates, and ultimately, a heavily suppressed lifetime earning capacity. The hidden, uncalculated cost of the forced real estate transaction is the absolute dismantling of the child's educational foundation. Beyond the easily quantifiable financial metrics, there is the massive silent economic burden of time poverty. An intact household possesses two distinct, overlapping parental bandwidths. If one parent is working extended hours to generate capital, the other can invest time directly into the child's human capital through homework assistance, extracurricular transportation, and vital daily mentorship. In a fractured household, time becomes the most heavily taxed and scarce resource imaginable. In the unforgiving economic environment of 2026, the primary custodial parent is routinely forced to take on secondary employment or participate in the gig economy, simply to bridge the massive gap between stagnant wage growth, artificially inflated rent, and entirely insufficient child support transfers. The money transferred through child support rarely goes toward the child's direct advancement. It is almost entirely absorbed into the primary parent's general operating budget, just to keep the lights on. This reality leaves millions of children like Michael effectively unparented during crucial, formative hours. The severe reduction in direct parental investment time serves as a profound economic handicap, mathematically reducing the child's competitive advantage in an increasingly ruthless, hyper-competitive global labor market. When you zoom out from the individual tragedy and look at the macroeconomic implications over the last 50 years, the proliferation of this dynamic has fundamentally altered the American social and economic fabric. We are observing the systemic, industrialized production of an entirely new socio-economic demographic, the downwardly mobile children of the former middle class. These children inherit zero tangible assets. They inherit no appreciating real estate portfolio, no functional professional network, and no debt-free educational head start. Instead, they inherit the systemic, crippling anxieties of single-parent economics and the brutal necessity of entering the adult workforce severely over-leveraged. When you multiply Michael's specific scenario by millions of families year after year, decade after decade, you begin to truly understand why the modern wealth gap is mathematically insurmountable for the average citizen. The generational wealth relay race was deliberately interrupted, the baton was dropped, and the legal system charged an astronomical premium for the privilege of watching it shatter on the ground. The most terrifying aspect of this reality is that couples like David and Emily, exactly like tens of millions of modern Americans, never explicitly understood the terms of the contract they were signing. They entered into what they deeply believed was a purely private, romantic, and spiritual partnership, entirely unaware that they were simultaneously executing a highly binding, entirely unnegotiated commercial contract with the state itself. They did not realize that by simply applying for a standard marriage license, they were legally inviting the government to become an active third-party stakeholder with ultimate authority over every single dollar they would ever earn, every piece of property they would ever purchase, and the fundamental destiny of their own children. How exactly did a simple piece of paper, traditionally viewed as nothing more than a beautiful cultural milestone, become the most dangerous, legally binding financial instrument in the entire American legal system? To understand the true mechanics of this trap, we must dissect the obscure, hidden legal precedents of the marriage license itself, and how the state subtly claimed absolute, unyielding jurisdiction over the private wealth of the American citizen. To understand the true nature of this legal bind, we have to look past the cultural romance of the wedding ceremony and examine the cold, hard mechanics of the marriage license itself. For the vast majority of human history, and certainly throughout early American history, marriage was primarily a religious sacrament or a common law agreement recognized by the localized community. You did not need a standardized piece of paper from a government clerk to build a life, combine assets, or raise children. The widespread requirement of a state-issued marriage license is a relatively modern phenomenon, gaining total national traction only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While historically introduced for a variety of public policy reasons ranging from tracking vital statistics to enforcing archaic demographic restrictions, the ultimate macroeconomic result was the quiet, total nationalization of the family unit. When you stand in a county courthouse in the year 2026 and sign a marriage license, you are not merely formalizing your emotional commitment to your partner. You are executing a highly complex, legally binding civil contract. But here is the fundamental trap that catches millions of middle-class Americans entirely off guard. It is not a contract between two people. It is a tripartite contract. There are three distinct parties involved: you, your spouse, and the state in which you reside. And the state is not a silent, passive witness. The state is the sovereign senior partner with absolute controlling interest over the terms, conditions, and potential dissolution of that agreement. Because the state is the entity that grants the legal status of the marriage, the state retains the absolute, unyielding authority to dictate exactly how the accumulated wealth of that marriage will be managed, categorized, and ultimately divided if the union fractures. The most dangerous and unprecedented aspect of this three-party civil contract is that the state possesses the legislative power to unilaterally alter the terms of the agreement long after you have signed it, without ever requiring your updated consent. Imagine a case study involving a middle-class couple, Robert and Linda, navigating this reality right now. Let us say they were married 20 years ago, building a life under a specific set of state laws regarding asset division and spousal support. They accumulated a home, heavily funded retirement accounts, and a modest portfolio based on those specific legal understandings at that time. However, by the year 2026, their state legislature has passed sweeping, aggressive reforms fundamentally altering the algorithms used to calculate lifetime alimony and the equitable distribution of deferred compensation. If Robert and Linda enter the family court system today, they are not judged by the legal framework that existed when they formed their partnership. They are subjected entirely to the new 2026 statutes. The state simply rewrote the financial rules of their private contract mid-flight, retroactively applying new wealth transfer algorithms to decades of their past labor. To grasp the sheer scale of this jurisdictional power, you must understand how the state actively reclassifies your private property the moment that license is signed. Prior to the marriage, your income, your debts, and your assets are strictly your own. The second the legal ink dries, the state lays an invisible blanket over the couple, creating a brand new, highly regulated legal entity known as the marital estate. Under the historical trends of family law, whether you reside in a community property state or an equitable distribution jurisdiction, the fundamental premise remains identical. Almost every single dollar earned, every piece of equity gained, and every retirement contribution made during the tenure of the marriage is no longer your private property. It belongs to the marital estate, a pool of capital that the state now has total legal authority to dissect and reallocate based on judicial discretion. Imagine if Robert started a small local service business 2 years before marrying Linda. He worked 80-hour weeks, built the initial client list, and established the foundational value of the company entirely on his own. Under normal commercial contract law, his ownership is absolute. But under the jurisdiction of the family court, the active appreciation in the value of that business during the marriage becomes a highly contested marital asset. The state does not care whose name is legally listed on the limited liability company operating agreement. The state dictates that because the business grew in value while the marriage contract was active, the marital estate is entitled to a massive portion of that growth. To extract that value during a divorce, the court will practically force Robert to hire extremely expensive forensic accountants to establish a localized, highly subjective business valuation, immediately siphoning vital operating capital away from the business and into the legal system. The potential outcomes routinely involve the business owner being forced to take on massive commercial debt just to legally buy back their own company from their former spouse, severely crippling the economic viability of the enterprise moving forward. Furthermore, the submission to state jurisdiction completely obliterates any concept of financial privacy for the American middle class. In a functioning marriage, your financial maneuvers are largely private. In a state-mandated dissolution, the mandatory discovery process turns your entire financial history inside out. To facilitate the state's division of your assets, you are legally compelled under the threat of perjury and contempt of court to produce years of tax returns, every single bank statement, credit card receipts, retirement projections, and business ledgers. Every financial decision you have made over the last decade is scrutinized, debated, and weaponized by opposing legal counsel in a public court setting. This absolute transparency is not designed to help the family achieve emotional closure. It is designed to give the state and the secondary legal industry the exact blueprints required to locate, evaluate, and extract every available dollar from the marital estate. The marriage license essentially functions as a pre-signed search warrant for your entire net worth, waiting to be activated the moment a divorce petition is formally filed with the county clerk. This total loss of privacy and autonomous control over personal property is the absolute core of the middle-class vulnerability. You have willingly handed the keys to your financial fortress to a massive bureaucratic system that fundamentally treats your life's work as a simple math problem to be solved through forced liquidation and wealth transfer. But understanding that the state has the power to divide your wealth is only half of the terrifying equation. To truly comprehend the modern American wealth gap and the permanent financial scarring left on the middle class, we must look at the exact mechanisms the state uses to enforce these sweeping judicial decisions. We must examine what happens when the gavel falls, the final decree is issued, and the state unleashes the full, terrifying enforcement apparatus of the government to ensure the permanent transfer of your capital. How exactly does the system guarantee payment for decades to come, and what draconian measures are deployed against those who simply cannot afford the mathematical impossibilities ordered by the court? Let us look at the enforcement machine. The enforcement machine of the American family court system is a uniquely powerful apparatus that operates with the level of authority and invasiveness that would be considered unconstitutional in almost any other civil legal context. In a standard civil dispute, such as a breach of contract between two corporations, if one party fails to pay a judgment, the prevailing party must engage in a lengthy, often difficult process of locating assets and filing for garnishments or liens. However, because the family court operates under the historical precedent of parens patriae and the police power of the state to protect the public welfare, it bypasses the standard protections afforded to most American citizens. Once a judge signs an order for child support or alimony, that debt is not merely a civil obligation. It is a court-mandated directive that carries the threat of immediate state-sponsored coercion. Imagine a case study right now in 2026 involving a middle-class professional named Stephen. Stephen is a mid-level project manager who, following a contentious divorce, has been ordered to pay a combined sum of child support and spousal maintenance that accounts for nearly 60% of his take-home pay. In the inflationary economy of 2026, where the costs of basic necessities like rent, utilities, and insurance have outpaced his annual salary increases, Stephen finds himself in a position where a minor economic shock, a medical emergency, or a temporary reduction in work hours renders him unable to pay the full court-ordered amount. In any other area of life, this would be a matter of debt negotiation or bankruptcy. In the family court, this is treated as a willful act of defiance known as contempt of court. The state's primary tool for enforcement is the immediate and automatic wage withholding order. This is a highly efficient mechanism where the state sends a direct legal directive to Stephen's employer, requiring them to deduct the support payments from his paycheck before he even sees the money. This effectively turns the employer into an unpaid agent of the state. For the middle-class professional, this introduces a profound level of reputational risk and career instability. When a human resources department receives a wage withholding order, it signals that the employee is involved in high-stakes litigation, potentially making them a liability for future promotions or sensitive projects. Historically, the presence of these orders has led to subtle, yet devastating career stagnation for many high-earning individuals. If the wage withholding is insufficient, the enforcement machine scales up rapidly. One of the most aggressive tactics used by states today is the automatic suspension of professional and driver's licenses. Imagine if Stephen, whose job requires him to visit various job sites across several counties, suddenly loses his driver's license because he fell behind on payments due to a localized economic downturn. The state's logic is that the threat of losing his livelihood will force him to find the capital. However, the practical outcome is often a self-fulfilling prophecy of financial ruin. Without the ability to drive, Stephen cannot perform his job duties. If he loses his job, he has zero income. Yet, the court-ordered debt continues to accrue every single month, regardless of his employment status. In the family court system, There is no automatic pause button for life's tragedies. Furthermore, these debts are historically unique because they are fundamentally immune to the protections of the United States Bankruptcy Code. Under federal law, child support and alimony are classified as domestic support obligations, meaning they cannot be discharged in a Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 bankruptcy. While Stephen could potentially discharge his credit card debt, medical bills, or personal loans to regain his financial footing, the debt owed to his former spouse and the state remains permanent and compounding. If he falls behind, the state applies high-interest penalties on the arrears, often ranging from 6 to 12% annually depending on the jurisdiction. For a middle-class earner in 2026, this interest alone can grow faster than their ability to pay, creating a permanent state of debt peonage that lasts for decades. The historical trends also show a terrifying expansion into the digital and global realm. The state now has the authority to intercept federal and state tax refunds, seize funds directly from bank accounts without a separate hearing, and place liens on any real property Stephen might attempt to purchase in the future. In the modern era, the state can even deny the issuance or renewal of a United States passport if arrears exceed a certain threshold,